Hi there, I'm Ron Humphrey. I'm the former co-coordinator, ministry coordinator for Social Action and Mission at Bloom in the Desert Ministries. And today I'm happy to present Bloom's 8th Community Justice Award to Rev Paula Procter Durrant. Paula is a lifetime UCC member and former pastor, retired pastor. Our award recognizes those individuals who are seeking to agitate for peace and justice in our community and around the world. And today we're going to present the award to Paula. Paula, for over the last 60 years, her life has intersected with all the major social action movements in our country, starting with the early civil rights movement in the 60s, on through to the current Black Lives Matters. She's engaged in most all of those movements over that time period. And today, in our interview, we're going to talk about some of her experiences. So Paula, right now, the Bloom book group is reading a book called If Jesus is Love, Don't Be a Jerk by John Pavlovich. In that book, the author talks about the spiritually combustible ignition point of activism. What ignited to get you involved in peace and justice to begin with?
I have not read that book, but I would argue there's another path from an explosive moment, and that is from a very young age. I worried about what was fair. What does it mean to be fair? Justice issues were I was born with this need to be involved in justice issues. So I can't point to a specific moment or day or time when social justice, peace, equality among people, those just seemed always to be with me. We were very active in congregational churches and then E&R, but I can remember even as a 12-year-old thinking, wait a minute, these people are talking about loving their neighbor, and there's not a lot of that going on unless you appear to be the same sort of neighbor. Mm-hmm. So I, from an early age, had those questions and concerns. Right. I think I was born. There must be a genetic something.
Yeah, I think the author also talks about the non-rightness of situations. I remember growing up in Peoria, where I knew that the segregation that we experienced there was not right, and that not rightness moved me to get involved. So I think that's how you feel fairness is a major issue.
Yeah, justice, fairness, equality. Much about the world I lived in, I was in a suburb of St. Louis, which was highly segregated and very racist, and it just didn't ever make sense to me.
Right. So when you were in seminary in Chicago in the 60s, you had a chance to meet a number of people who were important in the civil rights movement. Who were some of those, and how might they have influenced you?
Well, Jesse Jackson was a student in seminary when I was there. He was a year ahead of me. And with Jesse came a whole cadre of civil rights activists. Martin Luther King, it was about the time I arrived in Chicago, Martin Luther King decided that he wanted to move to the north for his movement, that Chicago was the most segregated city in America. I'm not sure that probably still is true. And so he came to Chicago, and he and Jesse and some others started something called Operation Breadbasket, which was an effort to get black people to buy and use black businesses for their needs. So Operation Breadbasket grew very quickly. It was a hot movement, and it went from Saturday church, it was always Saturday church before they did anything, that was held at my seminary to a bigger location. But while it was being held at Chicago Seminary, Martin Luther King was there a lot because it was one of his efforts.
Sure.
So there's a whole Andrew Young, there's a whole cadre of the civil rights activists who were
Yeah.
part of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and with Dr. King, who were just around.
So that was probably an exciting time to be there. I mean, there was other
Oh,
things,
boy,
other things
yes.
happening. What were some of the other?
Well, before civil rights, among the seminarians, the Vietnam War was an issue. That was the first. And I went to Chicago, and I'd been born in Chicago. I have a lot of relatives there. The first month I was there, we did a fasting, a 4-day, or I can't remember exactly how long, rice only, in solidarity with the Vietnamese people. And by some fluke of whatever, the media put me on the news. So my aunts called my mother and said, "What the hell is she doing?" I thought she was so
Right.
that was my first. Another piece, I don't think I put it in my biography, but I've been thinking a lot about it, is that my father died when I was 9 months old. I knew his mother very well, but there was a lot about his family that I did not know. And one of those things was a cousin of his who was on the faculty of the university, and a Quaker, and had some struggles, brought into my life Hannah Arendt and a few other, necessarily not justice movement people, but if you read on totalitarianism, Hannah Arendt's right on the page. So this environment for me was, it felt both exciting and home.
And of course, also that was probably the budding of the women's movement.
A little later.
A little later.
It was a little later.
Okay, good.
I mean, yes, it was, Betty Friedan was the 50s. And my seminary class, pardon me, my seminary class was 1/3 women. And that was the biggest class of women since World War II.
Wow.
Right after World War II, there was a large class of women. And then my class, whatever 1965 was, we had, I tried to count the other day and I couldn't remember, something like 14 or 15 women in a group of 45 or 50 people.
Great.
It was a good,
Good.
so the women around the seminary were all beside themselves with joy. And the women's movement was percolating.
Okay. Good.
And well,
Yeah.
we'll get to that later maybe.
Sure. Well, moving back in time a little bit from seminary, while you were in college, you had an opportunity with some students and a professor to go to the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota and help build a community center or tribal center. How did that experience influence your thoughts about the reservation system?
Well, about inequality in the United States more than the reservation system, I think. I was startled. I am still startled because I have a friend who's a Navajo weaving lady. And there are still people living on the reservation lands who are 2 hours from fresh water. They don't have vehicles that work very well. The abject poverty and lack of opportunity on the Pine Ridge Reservation in the 1960s, I would say, opened my eyes a little more than they'd been open.
Sure.
It struck me then, and it continues to strike me, that the gap between the stated values of the United States and the practical action of the United States is a huge gap.
Yeah, you bet.
So,
Yeah.
it,
Well, you touched on this a little bit earlier, but on a summer job you had a chance to work a youth program in the projects in St. Louis. You told me that experience shocked you.
Again, it's the same. It's the same idea in a different setting. I don't know what I expected because I came to that from a lovely Republican suburb of St. Louis and into the city where people, they don't have them anymore, but at the time they had the high rises for low income people, and the high rises, I don't know, 20 stories, big buildings that were chock-a-block full of people struggling to stay above board. And yet many that we came in touch with, we didn't come in touch with everybody, were decent, hardworking, deserving, I don't know what that means, but just normal people. But the poverty, the struggle, the I don't know how we're going to feed the kids tonight problem.
Right.
Just, it again shocked me. So, and that's another, so I go back to the church in the nice little suburb, and they talk about love and all this stuff. And they live 20 miles from these people who are,
Yeah, that's
whose life suffering is heartbreaking.
the unfairness of this.
The injustice of it all.
Yeah.
And it made no sense.
Right.
I mean, right now I'm on a little committee with my friends up in the high desert. We're trying to put blip ads into the local media up there for democratic values. And the one I'm working on right now is an ad that says, why in this society are the most valued workers, the daycare people, the nursing home attendants, those who give such kind and loving service to others, why are they paid the least in our culture?
Right. Yep. Good question. Well, let's move on to another topic. When you were serving as a pastor in a church in Massachusetts, the marriage equality legislation passed in that state. Was that a difficult issue for your congregation, and how did you handle that?
Well, it was a difficult issue for a few members of our congregation. It came as a huge shock to everybody. I mean, I don't know, it was on a Friday and we go to church on Sunday and I go, what happened? What did they do? For the most part, it was a non-issue. We had several gay couples in the congregation. They were ecstatic, so there was some sense of celebration about that. There was one man, and this is a 180-member church, I think, one man who took me off into my office and was screaming at me about how it ruined his marriage. How could they ruin his marriage? This is like 10 minutes before church starts. And I said, I don't understand. You have to explain that to me a little more. Because I can't understand how it has anything to do with my marriage. How does it have to do with your marriage? So he was peripheral. More interesting to me was that was an old generational church. So there was one family that were very active, pillars, who had 4 generations. The grandmother was probably in her 80s then. Wonderful, lovely woman. The daughter was in her 60s, 50s, and the children were in their 30s, and they had children. The second generation, the daughter and her husband was moderator of the church at that point. And so he came into my office after the other guy had left and said, "This is fascinating to me, Paula." And I said, "What are you talking about, Joel?" He said, "Kathy, the grandma who's in her 80s, she's horrified. Caroline and I think, I don't know what to think. Their kids all said, oh, who cares? It's about time. Let it happen. We're fine with it. Just non-issue." And I said, it's a non-issue, Joel. They're right. You know, it's a civil rights issue. It's a human rights issue. And that was the end of the conversation in the church. We never had to have any big, never, nothing. It just wasn't an issue for only a few people.
Yeah.
And Kathy, I just loved her. The older woman, much as she did with the cleaning up the language, we had some trouble over that too. She thought about it and thought about it and thought about it and realized it was what's the right thing to have happen.
All right.
So that church, for the most part, had such decent, thoughtful people in it that we did not have. And I don't recall it being an issue for any of the clergy community that I was a part of, or it just was another step in the direction of
good progress. So one time the UCC General Synod put together a delegation to come to the Coachella Valley to stand with Cesar Chavez and
Dolores Huerta. Don't forget Dolores.
Dolores Huerta, you bet. In their efforts to improve conditions for farm workers. Do you feel those efforts bore fruit?
That is a hard question. It was the St. Louis General Synod, and my mother and stepfather lived in St. Louis, so I was there not as a delegate, but as an observer. And when it came time to fill the plane, what was his name? I can't think of his name. The guy who was the organizer. There were seats, and I was able to get on the plane with some of my friends, so we flew out. Now that I live here, I know exactly where we were, but at the time, it's like this great big. What I believe about that event was it was a statement to the United Church of Christ about where our values rest, as much or more as it was a statement of support for Cesar Chavez and his work. It was certainly a farm labor strike. It was the union was involved. They were seeking to get the growers to provide basic human facilities.
Right.
The one issue that I was thinking about this last week, the one thing that I came away from that with is that I just really wash my vegetables hard. It's true.
Right.
I had not given it thought before I was there listening to how poorly the growers provided for the workers. There were no facilities, there was no hand washing, there was nothing.
Yeah.
Nothing. It was, and the other thing about that trip that I thought about is we arrived mid-morning, I think, and by 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon, it was hot as the bloody hell. Now, we lived in New England. The group I was with, we sat down under a tree to get a little shade, and I said, you know what? I just figured out why siesta is very popular in Mexico.
Right.
Because it's too hot to do anything.
Yep.
But the workers were not given the privilege of siesta. They needed, because it's piecework, they needed to work through that horrible hot weather.
Yeah.
Regardless of...
Put food on their table.
Yep.
Right.
So your question was, did it do any good? I think it put the United Church of Christ on a new foot. Not that justice wasn't always a concern, but back then they were trying to be more careful about not offending anybody, not losing members,
Sure.
And now where they are is goodbye if you're not on our page, which is where I think that's fine that they are. But then there was a little more cautious.
Okay. Well, you touched on this a little bit earlier too, but since you retired from the clergy, I think in 2008? 2004, okay. You moved out here to the Yucca Valley. You and your friend Yolanda Brown have been active in justice issues. So what are give some examples of what you and Yolanda have been up to?
Well, we're on a hiatus right now, but after the George Floyd murder, we separately, just as two individuals, decided to put a Black Lives Matter sign up in the high desert. Now, that seems very innocuous, but we have a friend, a co-conspirator who's a printer, and she printed a really beautiful on a heavy plastic. And we found a location right at the top of the Morongo grade, Yucca grade, and put it up. It was ground level. It was a beautiful Black Lives Matter sign, and everything was copacetic until 3 days later when somebody stole the sign. So we put up number 2, Black Lives Matter. That one lasted about 12 hours before someone cut it in half. So then we said, well, maybe it's the message. Maybe if we put John Lewis, hate is too great a burden to bear. So we put hate is too great a burden to bear up. And that one lasted half a day. People. So then we looked around for a higher location, and that's when we started thinking about billboards. But we looked around for a location that would be less easily damaged. And I don't know if you know the Beatnik Cafe in downtown Joshua Tree.
I do.
There is a Beatnik Cafe that has an 11-foot sign. It's owned by the cafe. It's on the side street. So Teddy Quinn, who's the organizer of the Beatnik, allowed us to put our Black Lives Matter sign on one half of his huge banner. So our printer did 3 of those big, they're like 11 feet long, and this big, Black Lives Matter. We got it up there. It was beautiful. It's still there. A day later, now you have to stand on a truck bed to reach the sign. It's high. But someone managed to reach it with neo-Nazi symbols and stuff. But that foolish person also left neo-Nazi literature at every single storefront in downtown Joshua Tree. And a few of the storefronts had cameras. So the police came. We called the police every time we were damaged. The police came, and nothing ever happened again from that person. So I assumed they were caught. We don't know, but I assume they were caught. So then our big Black Lives Matter sign has been up for a year and a half, 2 years. It's getting on 2 years. And we've only had about 2 months ago, somebody had painted an O in front of lives, so it said Black Olives Matter. We took that away, got rid of that. And all this time, Yolanda and I are paying someone to do this work because we cannot ourselves do it. And then with the voting rights in Washington, Teddy decided to put the word votes over lives. And he went to some trouble himself and put it up. So it read Black Votes Matter, and that lasted about 3 days. It's gone. So then Yolanda and I were into the sign idea, really hot and heavy. So we talked with Lamar Billboards, and for 2 years, every 3 months, we put up a new message on the Lamar Billboard in Joshua Tree.
Yeah,
I don't remember them all. They were all about justice and civil rights and Black Lives Matter, quotes from John Lewis, quotes from Abraham Lincoln.
Right.
The ballot is stronger than the bullet, things like that. We did that for a couple of years. And then it sort of petered out because our wonderful contact at Lamar Sign left his job, and the new person doing the job wasn't as receptive to what we did. So right now we're on a hiatus. That is, there's no, except I'm trying to figure out how to get the Black Lives Matter sign fixed and maybe say votes and look less seedy, because it's been there too long and it's looking seedy.
Yeah. Well, obviously, you're still very active. You're sought out by the community to serve on boards and you give advice, and you're still fighting the fight, and it's pretty amazing. So, I know that you feel that some of this stuff has not been successful, but remember what Dr. King told us in his speech. He said that, and he used it from other people, was that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward freedom.
Justice.
And justice. Bends towards justice.
That was from, I just looked it up this week, I think his name is Pickering, a Unitarian minister in Massachusetts who became part of the Transcendentalists and was an abolitionist.
Right.
That's where that Obama and Martin King took that from.
Right.
The transcendental literature. But what I continue to think about is, so today there's something presents itself. Why should I sit back?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't, in terms of this award, I'm very honored and very shocked. And I'm not even sure I think I'm deserving. Because from my view, I've just lived the life I think everyone should live, which is stand up for justice issues when they arise, and speak and share.
Yeah, you said that the Micah quote is kind of a sort of your model too.
I've spent my whole life asking the question of how does one live? How are we called to live? And that was as a child that spoke to me, to do justly, love kindly, and walk humbly. And as an older woman now, an old aging woman, I don't remember, my old aging brain doesn't remember like it used to. Someone wrote, love God, love neighbor, end of story.
Mm-hmm.
Not much else to say about the subject.
Yes.
And I do believe that. I do believe that.
Well, Paula, we're proud to have you a part of our church, and I know that you were engaged in some of the movement to get Bloom off the ground to start with.
Oh, yes.
How did you get involved with that?
I guess I showed up at the door, and Kevin had his feet firmly cemented in the Methodist system that wasn't very welcoming of him. And there were a couple of very fine folks here at Bloom who were pushing UCC on Kevin, and I guess I just got on the bandwagon.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, the foundational documents which the UCC required before they would consider, I guess it's, I don't know, membership, Bloom's membership as a UCC. I can't think what that word is, that they would accept the congregation, recognize in the association. So I didn't find that at all difficult because I'd been through it.
Right.
With
Yep.
a couple of other congregations.
Sure. Well, we've skipped around quite a bit here. Is there anything that I've left out that you'd like to talk about? Another experience, or?
I think I'd like to say something about the women's movement.
Definitely.
Because 102 years ago, women earned the right to vote. That's not very long. The whole of Hebrew scripture and Christian scripture and Christian church history is a history in which women are second class, period, end of discussion. There might have been a woman here and there who did something extraordinary and gets mentioned. But in Jesus' day, women were possessions of their husbands. And that's why the widow and the orphan were such a big deal in the Gospels. Because a widow who didn't have some man to take care of her was out on the streets. was a very harsh time for women. And I, having spent my whole career in working in a majority male, I don't think that's true now, but it was when I was there, profession, I think through a lot of the second classness of what it meant to be a woman in the ministry. And I think that it's the last civil rights issue to be recognized truly as a civil rights issue. The women who are on the liberation movement are still seen as kind of shrill and a man-hating or lesbians or some pejorative name that they're called.
Well, obviously, Paula, you're still very engaged. You're out there challenging, you're questioning, you're bending the arc, and Bloom is proud to present you the 8th Community Justice Award, and we're proud to have you as one of us. Thank you.
Thank you. I really feel it's undeserved, but I appreciate it very much.
It's deserved.